Welcome everyone, Questine here to talk about tanks for World of Warcraft The Burning Crusade Classic. What do each of them have to offer and how do they stand in relation to one another? First we have Protection Warriors, the prima donnas of Burning Crusade, perhaps more so than Shamans. There is perhaps no tank class played in the history of WoW that has seen more arrogant and self-centered players than the Warrior, especially when thinking about the good old days of Vanilla and Burning Crusade. It's not surprising, seeing as the name of one of the most famous, or rather infamous, warrior player in the world, Kungan, literally means king. So don't be shocked if you find many arrogant would-be kings in their ranks, and yes, I do say this as someone who is currently playing a warrior tank in Classic WoW. I know what it's all about. This isn't to say that this approach is bad, quite the contrary. For any tank, especially main tanks, it's absolutely the correct way of doing things. Some of the best tanks in World of Warcraft have been those willing and able to take charge, to put themselves forward along with their raid, to understand what mechanics they're dealing with, and to seek to constantly improve themselves as players. Warriors can excel at this far more easily than other tanks, since the perception everyone has about them is that they are the main tanks in the game, the ones that can handle mostly everything in terms of boss mechanics, and this is quite true. It's not just an issue of perception. To begin with, warriors, due to their high base stats, defensive stats, and shield block, have the best survivability right out of the gate. Since crushing blows are a major issue in the Burning Crusade, shield block is quite useful since it allows a warrior with crap gear to get immune to crushing blows while the ability is active. This in turn means that they don't have the same initial gearing issues that Paladins and Druids have to handle, and allows them an enormous amount of flexibility early on with their gearing. The only thing that they need in order to tank is to get to 490 defense, and then they can go for whatever path they want. Hit, block, avoidance, armor, stamina. It's all perfectly viable. And the difference between a great warrior and a weak warrior player is not so great when it comes to survivability. Threat-wise, that's a different discussion, and obviously there is a big difference between a good tank and a mediocre tank. But anyway, it's what makes warriors the best tanks early on, since they don't have the same gearing issues. Furthermore, with Blizzard themselves having stated on multiple occasions that they designed bosses around the idea guilds would be using warrior tanks, you end up with certain encounters where druids or paladins can't tank, or it's far more painful to use them compared to a warrior. I'm thinking of all the bosses that use silence, the bosses that use fear, the bosses that crush. Illidan can't be tanked by a druid, for instance. The mana drain situation that paladins have to deal with. Basically, warrior is the most reliable tank you can use. Is it the best? Not quite. Because then we have druids, the furry boys. In all my years of playing World of Warcraft, I have never understood why, in a game focused in large part on gearing up your character, you'd ever want to be staring at a bear's ass all day, and where the gear you acquire is meaningless in how your character looks. In all seriousness though, feral druids are fairly strong and flexible. Being able to DPS and tank in the same spec is an enormous advantage for any raid team, since many bosses might only require 1 or 2 tanks, but the trash to said boss may require 3. That's where druids come in, and they can do fairly decent damage for a melee DPS anyway, and actually good damage if they are given the necessary gear. They also provide a highly desirable party buff for physical DPS, as tanks druids start out fairly weak from a survival perspective. They can't parry or block attacks, so they can't avoid getting hit by crushing blows, and their class is built around them having large amounts of armor and HP to tackle that. But that doesn't work so well when you are lacking gear initially. On top of that, they, like warriors and paladins, have to get immunity to critical blows, which is a particular problem for them since much of their actual raid gear doesn't have any defense rating. What ends up happening with druids is that even with good raiding gear, they will take the most damage out of all of the tanks from a physical damage perspective, and especially from a spell damage perspective. Don't be surprised if using a druid as a tank in a fight that requires resistance gear might see your raid wipe quite a few times given the ridiculous amount of damage they can and will take. Even once they have great gear, they still have these issues, but in most situations they can handle tanking the content just fine, despite the fact they will be eating quite a good amount of crushing blows. The reason guilds will want them is because they are, by quite a large margin, the best off tanks in the game, and this is due to their threat. Paladins, warriors, to a certain degree, rely on being hit to generate optimal threat output. Not only do druids not have the same problem, but because of the way their class works, will actually end up generating the most threat in a fight where you might be fighting to be second on threat as a tank, and overall their single target threat can very well be the best in the entire game. And as we've seen in Classic so far, your survival means squat if you can't hold aggro against the DPS. So that's the Druid. While they won't cover themselves in the same glory as Warriors or Paladins will, they actually get stuff done, and are a solid and needed addition to a raid team. Until Blizzard decided to remove crushing blows from the game. This is what happens when you design a tank around the idea that they may take more damage thanks to crushing blows, and give them higher armor and HP to tackle that particular challenge, and then remove the challenge in itself. That is Sunwell Plateau tanking in a nutshell. One of the hardest raids ever designed by Blizzard in the history of the game, in the one expansion well known for being extremely difficult. With just one raid tier, Druids went from being okay main tanks that could hold their own against Warriors and Paladins in most situations, to being flat out the best tanks in the game. It doesn't quite matter that you're still a tank taking the most amount of damage in the game when you're the only one who can survive taking free weapon hits from Brutalis without cooldowns, or avoiding being turned to paste by Felmist. Then there's the healing aspect, which cannot be ignored for any tank. Throughout the years, healers have stressed out to me in great detail how they vastly prefer dealing with consistent tank damage against spiky damage. And when crushing blows stop being a factor for Druid tanks, the fact they don't have parry or block stops being a problem, but an actual advantage, since it makes healers prefer dealing with Druid tanks than anyone else. The advantage Druids got to the removal of crushing blows was so enormous that they were in large part the best tanks in Wrath the Lich King. People talk about how strong Death Knights and Paladins were in Wrath, and they were, but we were all bowing our heads to our new Druid overlords. Then Blizzard introduced block mastery and Cataclysm and made Paladins ridiculously strong. I guess the history of tanking in WoW is moving from being a complete joke to being extremely overpowered, and in the case of Paladins, so overpowered that you could solo tank raids which would normally require an entire team. That is the very essence of a protection Paladin, even in the Burning Crusade. Paladins, regardless of the years that have passed, regardless of the changes, are still the dipshits that charged into the Horde in Orgrimmar just because they could during vanilla, and then used Bubble Hearthstone, much to the fury of the Horde players that couldn't do anything. You may not be able to do that anymore, but the Bubble Boys are still fundamentally the same players, the holier-than-thou crusaders of truth and justice with an almost unmatched zeal as players. They are, to the Burning Crusade, what mages are currently in Classic. You know how mages can solo entire 5-man dungeons in Classic and even much of the raid trash in Zul'Gurub with crap gear or even no gear? Yeah, that's the Paladin. Except that they don't rely on slows, blink, or kiting. They just take the mobs, gather them up, and have those mobs kill themselves by hitting you. It's a powerful way to get gold quite easily. In the same way, they are the only AoE tanks for raiding in the Burning Crusade, and it's not just that they can do AoE threat via Consecration, it's that they have far higher survivability while doing so. A Paladin can be tanking far more mobs than either a Druid or a Warrior, and be taking less damage than either of them. This is due to the mechanics of Holy Shield, Redoubt, and even Ardent Defender, which when combined really help out the Paladin to do crazy things in dungeons and raids that other tanks wouldn't even dream of. Boss-wise, they can tank any boss in the game and handle the vast majority of them quite well. The only exceptions are those that have either silence mechanics or mana burn mechanics. Though surprisingly, at least one of these bosses, Reliquary of Souls in Phase 3, heavily favors Paladins over Warriors or Druids because of the way the Rage Burn works versus the Mana Burn. Where they shine, though, is whenever they're dealing with a boss that has multiple attacks. Many bosses, especially early on, have Crushing Blows and Parry Haste, and a certain number of them also have abilities that may consume your block charges, be it Shield Block or Holy Shield. As a Paladin, you don't really care, since Holy Shield, although it gives less of an increase to block chance compared to Shield Block, has so many charges, it's unlikely any boss would consume them all. But as a warrior, it can be a problem since you only have 2 charges on Shield Block. Prince Malchezaar in Karazhan is the most ridiculous example where this comes into play. He dual wields, has Parry Haste, can do Crushing Blows, and has extra attacks in Phase 2 when he pulls out his axes. He can hit with so many attacks at the same time that he can almost insta-gib pre-raid gear tanks. And on top of that, the cherry on the cake, he can also do Sunder Armor on the tank. As a warrior or druid, the best way to tackle him is to build a huge threat lead in Phase 1, so your DPSers can go crazy in Phase 2, while you avoid hitting him to avoid triggering Parry Haste. As a Paladin, you just don't give a damn, since the only attacks that can trigger Parry Haste in your case are literally your white swings. You can always stop doing them, of course, and still generate a very substantial portion of your threat. Combine that with your Holy Shield charges, and you avoid getting crushing blows, if you have the gear. You can also use Divine Shield with the Cancel Aura macro to remove Sunder Armor. So Prince Malchezaar is a fairly extreme case where Paladins are vastly better than Warriors or Druids in terms of tanking. Most bosses won't have this, but the same principles do apply on quite a few boss encounters. Paladins do, however, have some major issues, gear in particular. They scale quite well with it and become very powerful threat and survival-wise, but early on a Paladin tank has to go for some very specific gearing to become a powerful tank. It's nothing too ridiculous like the tailoring crafted gear, but it does require genuine effort, and it's where most Paladin players fail completely and utterly. That's because there's too much of a mage mentality in many protection Paladins and not enough of a main tank mentality, the mentality of taking charge, of knowing what you can really offer to a raid. What you need as a Paladin tank is to get 102.4% miss, dodge, parry, block chance to avoid crushing blows, and this requires very specific items pre-raid to pull off and an understanding of what your class can do. Most World of Warcraft players are at best mediocre, to put it kindly, and the vast majority of Paladin tanks I've met in the Burning Crusade have not come close to realizing the potential of what the class can do. They instead prefer to accept being a trash tank with the gear built for, in their mind, AoE tanking. Never mind the fact that getting 102.4% avoidance plus block is actually useful for AoE tanking because it helps you reduce the damage. If every hit that you're taking is a miss, a dodge, a parry, or a block, you are taking significantly less damage than a tank that is getting hit by normal hits from trash or bosses. And that's not even counting crushing blows. Though, to be perfectly frank with all of this, the perception the overall player base has, which thinks protection paladins are worthless outside of, say, bosses like Morgrim Tidewalker, really doesn't help things. It is not a fun experience to deal with as a protection paladin, even when you are a well-geared player who's put in a lot of effort in his gearing to be viewed as being trash, even though you've worked quite hard to get there. So why bother with it? Well, the answer to that is because if you do bother with it, you can pull off insane stunts that people didn't even dream about on retail Burning Crusade. And why limit it to just one protection paladin? Why not have, say, 2 protection paladins doing all of Serpent Shrine Caverns as a particular example, as a possibility? It could work quite well depending on the tuning Blizzard goes for. But regardless of that, it doesn't matter because paladin tanks are going to be essential for any guild that cares about speedruns. They just require good, dedicated players to manage it, more so than warriors or druids. So now that I've said all of that, where do each of these tanks stand in relation to one another on a tier list? Well, that depends on a large number of factors. Obviously, for anything involving AoE tanking or tanking multiple targets, paladins are the kings by far and away, followed by warriors, followed by druids. But for bosses, that really does depend. It depends on their HP, their damage, how long is the fight, what kind of raid setup do you have, what kind of gear do you have, what mechanics do you have to deal with, and how much do you care about them, and how big of a deal is threat. So there's a lot of variables that go into this. But speaking from a fairly generalized, broad perspective, I would expect something like this. For pre-raid early tier 4 gearing, protection warriors are above by quite a bit compared to protection paladins and feral druids for boss tanking specifically. With late tier 4, tier 5, once protection paladins and feral druids start getting gear, they will start to get closer and closer to warriors, to the point that by the end of tier 5, it could very well be that protection paladins and feral druids are largely on par with protection warriors. You do have to consider the fact that protection warriors do get an incredible 4-step bonus with tier 5 for their threat benefit, so that's something that they do have going for them. But it could also very well be that you might not care for warriors at all for speedruns, because paladins are needed for AoE tanking. Druids have the flexibility between DPSing and tanking, what warriors have, right? That's something to consider. And with tier 6, once you start getting into tier 6 gear, protection paladins and feral druids end up being on top of protection warriors. Now, the reason behind this, with tier 6, with Zulaman gear, with Sunwell Plateau gear, the reason this happens is because tier 6 gear in particular is such an enormous upgrade for both prop palas and feral druids. It's an enormous upgrade in both survivability and threat generation for both of them. And while tier 6 gear obviously is good for warrior, tier 5 is the set that generates the most threat thanks to the force set bonus. So warriors tier 6 is in some ways a side grade compared to tier 5, at least from a threat perspective. They're basically giving up some threat bonuses for other stats, whereas Paladins and Feral Druids just gain better gear overall, flat out, no discussion. Tier 6 is considerably better than Tier 5 and Tier 4 in every single respect for these two. So when you're looking at Tier 6, with Tier 6 gear, early Tier 6, late Tier 6, farming Black Temple Mount Hyjal, doing Zulaman, doing Sunwell Plateau, Protection Paladins and Feral Druids just end up being on top in many situations. All of them? No. There are some cases, some mechanics which do favor Protection Warriors still, but overall, Paladins and Druids end up being better by the end game. So that's all there is to say on this subject. I will probably make a dedicated Protection Warrior tanking guide and a Feral Druid gearing up guide because it's so important for that particular class. As always, thank you all for watching. Stay tuned for more. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. And if you do appreciate my content, please do consider supporting me via PayPal, YouTube channel membership, or Patreon, because these videos do actually take quite a lot of work to make. That's one of the reasons I've slowed down. But yeah, stay tuned for more. I still have a lot of things to discuss about the Burning Crusade. There's quite a lot of things to talk about in general when it comes to World of Warcraft. Stay tuned for that.